Hallo zusammen. Pascal hier von Neutrality Studies.
Hello everyone, Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and today I have Mr. Dirk Pohlmann with me, a German book author and documentary film director. Mr. Pohlmann is currently working on a book about political assassinations in Europe and America, including JFK, Olof Palme, Enrico Mattei, Dag Hammarskjöld, and the case we want to discuss today, Alfred Herrhausen, the head of Deutsche Bank back in the late 1980s. Mr. Pohlmann, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
With pleasure, at your place. I think very highly of your show.
Thank you very much. I'm of course very pleased about that. And we started talking because, in an earlier episode, I briefly mentioned Alfred Herrhausen, or one of my guests did. Then, through mutual viewers, we were put in touch. And you have already done quite a bit of work on Herrhausen as well. Could you briefly explain what the case is, how it unfolded, what the current state of knowledge is, and how your sources now fit into this?
So Alfred Herrhausen was the sole spokesman of Deutsche Bank, essentially the head of Deutsche Bank, you could say. And he came to that position as a manager from the electrical industry. So he was atypical for a banker and was one of the most charismatic figures in the history of the Federal Republic. So not a typical banker who stays in the background, but someone who's shown in every talk show, who had no trouble talking circles around journalists in interviews. And he did so intelligently, not just with rhetorical skill. He was very unusual. He was intellectually very agile and was known as a banker, who, something that became known in Germany, brought up, for example, debt relief for Mexico and also for the Third World. Not 100%, maybe 50%, but definitely enough to get them functioning. He thought a lot about the social impact of banking. So he wasn't a classic shareholder value banker, but rather someone close to Catholic social teaching. His idea was that a business deal should always be beneficial for both sides. And that's why the murder of Herrhausen by the third generation of the RAF was viewed with suspicion from the very beginning within the leftist scene. That is, the left liberal scene, whether it really was the RAF. Why, of all people, would they kill this banker, the left's favorite banker, their favorite conservative, so to speak? Why kill him in particular?
And may I briefly point out, just to clarify, the RAF refers to the Red Army faction, not the Royal Air Force. So that's the terrorist group that kept Germany on its toes in the 1970s and 1980s. And when exactly was the murder committed again?
On November 30th, 1989, so right after the fall of the wall. And that's also the point when I got the assignment. That was because the publisher was friends with one of the authors of the book RAF Phantom. It was about this murder and other murders. The thesis was that this third generation didn't actually exist. It was an invention of the intelligence services. And that's what I was actually supposed to elaborate on. But during my research, I ended up somewhere completely different, namely at the fact that Herrhausen was indeed murdered by this third generation. The third generation is structured very differently from the first two generations. The strangest thing is perhaps that the members of the third generation, I managed to speak with people from this group, didn't even realize at first that they were the third generation. You were labeled that way from the outside and then adopted it. Can you explain that? First, second, third generation? First generation, Baader Meinhof, meaning Ulrike Meinhof, a brilliant journalist, Andreas Baader, and also the lawyer involved, sorry, I just forgot the name, a famous lawyer who later joined the NPD. So a very interesting figure who had achieved the best law exam results in Berlin up to that point. There's that documentary about the lawyers. So the first generation were actually intellectuals. The second generation were people you would have liked to recruit for an intelligence service, with intellectual capacity, but above all, with a coldness and an ability to commit murders that was uncharacteristic.
Möglichkeit, Morde zu begehen, die untypisch war. Die erste war noch anders. Das waren Leute, die sind da.
The first generation was different. Those were people who, I would say, just ended up in those situations. And the third generation is a lot of flotsam in Berlin. For example, people like Burkhard Garweg, who is still on the run from the third generation, is a street kid. I found out he is illiterate. These are people who belong to a completely different category. A mix of people who could have been part of the second generation as well. Many anti-imperialists, or anti-imps, as they called themselves in Berlin. So half of them are people that, as an intelligence service, you would stay away from, because they are involved with drugs, because they are completely unstable psychologically, and so on.
Psychisch komplett instabil sind und so weiter. Ist eine andere Struktur.
It's a different structure. All three, and the third one in particular, was infiltrated, provenly, by the Stasi. The Stasi also infiltrated the second generation. For example, Christian Klar was trained by the Stasi in the Spreewald on the use of the bazooka. He was an excellent bazooka marksman. There were, clearly, 10 people from the second generation who lived in East Germany, meaning they settled down there, the Stern family being named by the Stasi. By the way, as I know, they had already been in West Berlin before that. They were basically, as you would say in English, shell-shocked.
Shell-shocked im Englischen, ja. Also die waren
So they were under such psychological stress that they wanted to get out. Those are the three generations. And according to my calculations, the third committed 10 murders, because I also count the bodyguards and so on. Most publications don't include them in the count. But they are also people who were murdered, and they have a strange list of victims. The last two are the most peculiar. That's Alfred Herrhausen and Detlef Rohwedder. Two figures who actually, Rohwedder wanted to prevent the GDR from being sold out. And Herrhausen was a banker who wanted to introduce an ethical banking system. And what was not reported in Germany, which I mostly learned from academic literature in the Anglo-Saxon world, is that he made great efforts to integrate the Soviet Union after Gorbachev into an economic system in order to establish a peace order for Europe. That may have been his undoing. So, it's strange that so little is reported about this in Germany. I even found this in articles stating that his activities triggered sheer panic in the USA, because the idea was, or the situation was, that Germany, through its foreign policy, which was aimed at understanding among the Social Democrats, and Helmut Kohl basically continued this and did not end it, played a special role.
Helmut Kohl hat das im Grunde genommen weitergeführt und nicht beendet. Kohl war europäisch geprägt.
Kohl was shaped by a European perspective, meaning an attempt at a European order. And above all, the Social Democrats in Germany had very good relations with Poland, with Russia, the Soviet Union. I'll use Soviet Union synonymously here, but also with Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And Herrhausen was together with Horst Teltschik, the head of the German Chancellery, essentially the gray eminence of German politics. The head of the Chancellery is always a very important figure, also the head of the intelligence services, by the way. Herrhausen and Teltschik were together in Hungary. I was allowed to do an interview with Horst Teltschik. And he told me that back in '86, the Hungarians said you shouldn't talk to the old guys from the Politburo, but to them instead. Everything would change in Hungary. There would be a market economy, there would be elections. They wanted to turn the state upside down. They were the ones who represented the future. And he said that neither Herrhausen nor Teltschik could make sense of it. They were completely taken aback by this statement, but then realized that everything really was changing in the East. Herrhausen soon met Gorbachev and was absolutely thrilled by this man, whom he saw as the figure who, for that time, really was making everything new. The concrete of the Cold War was becoming liquid and could be poured into new forms.
Und konnte in neue Formen gegossen werden. Und Herrhausen sah die Möglichkeit, weil an den Krediten dran.
And Herrhausen saw the opportunity because he was involved with the loans and because he was also a friend and advisor to Helmut Kohl. Kohl, after an initial dispute in which he had called Gorbachev a propaganda chief, like Goebbels, later apologized but recognized the possibilities. Herrhausen was the liaison between Kohl and Gorbachev, and now saw the chance to help shape policy in Germany at a crucial point through this economic cooperation. He proposed something similar to what happened between Germany and France after World War II, namely that the former hereditary enemies, as my father still learned in school, became the driving force behind European unification.
Wurden zu Motoren der europäischen Einigung. Kohl selber hat ja Arte erfunden, den Fernsehsender.
Kohl himself actually invented Arte, the TV channel. The idea that Germans and French people should hear and see the same things, or at least be able to. So this cooperation between Germany and France, which started very pragmatically with the coal and steel agreements, then the European Economic Community, then political unification up to a common currency. So this sense of unity through pragmatic economic cooperation to do the same with the Soviet Union. He was very, well, Herrhausen, the more I learned about him, the more brilliant he seemed to me. He immediately saw, okay, let's do this. Poland was on the verge of bankruptcy, had hyperinflation, the Zloty crisis. He advocated for supporting Poland, and he wanted to support the Soviet Union, saying that it made no sense to just give loans, which is what happened, 3 billion, 12 billion, but that you have to help them train managers, because that's what's missing. There aren't people who can run things. And you have to do this cooperatively, almost in a trustee-like way, for at least a generation, so that trust can be built, so that the Soviets see they're not being taken advantage of, as they later were under Yeltsin. So you work together. Through this solid trust, you can achieve cooperation in all areas. Herrhausen spoke of Bismarckian possibilities. That is Bismarck, who was Germany's foreign minister at the time, and stood for friendship with Russia.
So, here we are dealing with a person with extremely visionary capabilities, also within a network that was unfolding at the time, and the opportunities that arose from it. And in this process, he was the head of Deutsche Bank. So the most important, how do you describe the word?
I can tell you this. In 1988, I got hold of the list of the 20 largest banks, and at that time, 11 of them were Japanese banks. So it was a completely different situation. And then there were 3 foreign banks, Crédit Agricole, French, Citicorp, and then Deutsche Bank. So one of the most significant banks in the world at that time was Japanese. And among the Western banks, Deutsche Bank was outstandingly financially healthy because it was something like the savings bank of German industry.
That's what connects them. The Japanese, as well as Deutsche Bank and a few others, mainly manage private assets, good old deposits from small investors like you and me. And Deutsche Bank was extremely well structured in this regard, and he was in charge of it all. And then this murder from the far left happened. Can we talk about that? So how did it happen and why? What was the RAF's logic in saying, we're going to kill this man now? Or what was the story told?
Well, the RAF, I can say that too. That's why I said earlier, in the left liberal spectrum, there was consternation that the man was murdered. But in the extreme left, this murder was celebrated. I can confirm that, so to speak. For example, in the Rote Flora, there was practically a party when the news came that Herrhausen had been murdered. For this group, there was no possibility that capitalism could have anything to do with reasonable politics. And he was one of the most important representatives of capitalism worldwide. Finally, from their perspective, one of the major figures from the enemy camp they had, meaning the military, essentially big capital, had been assassinated again. And within the group, there were enough people who definitely wanted to work toward eliminating this man. But you have to know, as I said, the RAF. What I know is that the RAF not only worked closely with the Stasi, which they did voluntarily, but they were also completely monitored on the Western side. And there were people within the RAF, even verifiably one person, but I know of several who had contact. And the leading figure of the RAF, who was never publicly known, from the third generation, the real leader, a woman, is still closely connected with Israel today. Well, that's a very remarkable transformation. She basically switched from being the Palestinian woman who made the connection to Israel. So that must have been an effective operation by the Israelis, but not just by them. There are strange statements I've received from the RAF, from people who later sought contact in the 2000s, where there was absolutely no interest, even on the American side, in having them share what they knew. This is related to the fact that we have to assume if this group is under complete surveillance, and if it happens that Herrhausen is murdered, you have to deal with how exactly they did it. Why did the RAF want to murder Herrhausen? Why can they be used effectively by having people who really want to do it? But why is it allowed to happen? So why isn't the group intercepted beforehand? We have a similar case in Italy with Aldo Moro, and when the third generation wanted to start dealing with Andreotti, they were taken down, basically arrested. That is, with the man who was involved in these matters on the state side. One always has to now, when I say this, it's immediately labeled a conspiracy theory. But all these cases are interesting enough to look into. And with Herrhausen, it's just that I can't prove there was an order. What I can prove is that the RAF was under surveillance. And my argument is, if a totally monitored group of terrorists murders someone who acts like Herrhausen, then the rest of the West German population has to ask, why? Why are they killing him of all people? Yes, there were plenty of cases. If you take the Schleyer case, who sat with the SS, with Heydrich in Prague, there's a certain logic to it. But with Herrhausen, the man who stood up for the Third World, who had a speech, finished and ready, that he was supposed to give in the US, but couldn't because he was murdered shortly before. In that speech, he talks about how now, after the end of the Cold War, November 30th, November 9th is the fall of the Berlin Wall.
30. November, 9. November ist Mauerfall. Am 30. November, also 2 Wochen später, 3 Wochen später.
On November 30th, so 2 or 3 weeks later, he wants to give this speech and say, all the money we've wasted on armaments can now be put to good use in the world. We can address the problems, the debt of the Third World. We can tackle global environmental issues. We can fight drug trafficking and terrorism. Those are the 2 favorite topics of ordinary people at that time. So, to put it plainly, we can now focus together on all the things that really matter, instead of getting lost in armaments. So, when you see that and then see that he is trying to achieve with the Soviet Union and with Poland and with the rest of the Eastern Bloc, what Germany and France managed to achieve, a peaceful cooperation that leads to, here it comes, Europe gaining power, and within Europe, especially Germany, because of its good relations with the Eastern Bloc, would have been in a pole position in this development. They would have basically started half a kilometer ahead of the rest of the field and could have really pulled ahead. So, Germany would have become a leading power in Europe, according to his plan, together with France. That was the idea. That's why he's talking about Bismarckian conditions. And then you see that this is a geostrategic situation that matches what the Anglo-Saxons have always feared, Russia and Germany together, and especially in such a situation. You also have to say, Herrhausen was considered a possible next chancellor in Germany, partly because he was brilliant, because he was charismatic, because he was a media personality. It was clear that he would step down as head of Deutsche Bank. And the question was, what would he do next? Would he become a professor of philosophy or chancellor?
Philosophieprofessor werden oder Bundeskanzler?
Well, an Alfred Herrhausen cannot be compared in any way to a Friedrich Merz, who was also an executive at a financial institution, namely BlackRock.
Aber das ist ein ganz anderer Schlag von Mensch.
But that's a completely different kind of person, a totally different personality. That's why I said Herrhausen was a big fan of Karl Popper, whom he also knew personally. And everything I see from him, the way he thinks, I can attribute exactly to Popper. So also a certain kind of rationalistic optimism. The idea that you are able, if you talk about these things within an open society also, let me finish the sentence. If you live in an open society, you can handle these things reasonably. You can come to arrangements that are actually peaceful if you don't let yourself be guided by ideological barriers, but instead approach things pragmatically. I would say Popper, well, he is clearly critical rationalism, but it's also a pragmatic philosophy. And there he felt very much at home, and now saw the opportunity to act with goodwill. For him, it was like Tetris, so to speak. The pieces are falling, and they all fit. He can now act in this direction. He can really participate here in a real and effective way. Let me put it in my own words. Germans are not only capable of war, they can also make peace, and in Europe too. That would have been the opportunity, and that's what motivated him. For example, he always suffered from, well, suffered might be too strong a word. It didn't lead to depression, but he felt it was unfair that journalists always looked for what interests he had, meaning small private interests, Deutsche Bank, or other such interests, in the way he acted. And he said, I am always looking for the best solution. I search, and this best solution is to be found almost in the Platonic sense, in the general sense, and not in a narrow way. What is best for me? In this respect, he cannot be compared to Friedrich Merz at all. That would also have been the risk with Herrhausen. I have also spoken with various people, and even once by chance talked to someone in the hospital who had attended a lecture by Herrhausen at Deutsche Bank. So, whenever I spoke with people, they said he never left without the staff being enthusiastic. He managed that. He left a trail of admiration and approval, and finally someone with capacity and goodwill was following him.
And can you tell us a bit more about him, how he actually came to hold this position? So did he work his way up through the bank, or did he work at other institutions?
No, he actually came from the energy sector, so West Germany, really the Ruhr area, and so on. And the energy sector is, so to speak, a core part of the old boys network there. And he grew up, he comes from a family. He was then a student at a Nazi elite school in Feldafing. He was born in 1930, so in 1945 he was 15. I once made a documentary also about these educational institutions, and in the time when he was shaped, it was like an English elite boarding school. That's not really political yet. So you're drilled for an elite mindset, for courage, a lot of sports, a lot of competition, so a competition ideology. And that's what shaped him. So if you read his letters from back then, it's not Nazi ideology. It's more like, we Feldafing students. We're really great guys, and we have honor in our bones, so to speak. And that had a big impact on him, I think. For example, he was also known for always getting along very well with the regular people at the bank, the secretaries, the drivers. He would have a beer with them. He was less suited for those champagne gatherings. That just wasn't really his world. But he's someone who rose through the ranks at the bank, thanks to his brilliance, through unconventional thinking. I can put it like this, and it serves as a good example. First, he sent people from the bank to Frankfurt University, young people from his team. He told them, go and listen to what unusual ideas are out there. It doesn't matter how they sound, whether they come from the left, the right, or anywhere anywhere else, even very left-wing ideas.
Links, rechts oder sonst was sind, also auch ganz linke Ideen. Das war in dem Fall damals waren die Unis ja noch eher links.
That was the case back then. At that time, universities tended to be more left-leaning. And then he would let people tell him about things, and if something was unusual, he would look into it. And he was also brilliant enough to really do that independently, to engage with it. He didn't need briefings from anyone. Rather, he had an incredible intellectual capacity to deal with such matters. And there's something else, a little story I always like to tell. He was invited to ZDF for a discussion with 2 other economists. And ZDF, in case things got too boring, had invited students, high school graduates from the area, who were supposed to ask cheeky questions, but they didn't end up being needed. Afterwards, one of those students, who worked at the Marxist bookstore, her parents had a catering service, and she helped serve, was standing there talking to one of those other people. And he said to her in this patronizing way, "Well, listening to you, one might think you vote Green, if you're even allowed to vote yet." The Greens back then were very different from today, leaving the blocks, ending the secret services, so a completely different structure than now. And then she looked at him and said, "Well, listening to you, I might think you vote CDU, if you're even allowed to think for yourself yet." And then everyone started laughing, just like you are now. Herrhausen heard this too and said to his assistant, "I want that woman. Give me her address. Next time I'm in Mainz, I want to meet with her."
Wenn ich das nächste Mal hier bin in Mainz, will ich mich mit ihr treffen. Ja? Und das wurde eine Freundschaft. Und
And that became a friendship. And this is just my feeling now. This isn't the journalist in me speaking, but rather the author. He really enjoyed talking to this young, cheeky, smart, honest person. Imagine, as the head of Deutsche Bank, you're surrounded by people who are either slipping on the slime trail they've left for you or trying to saw off the chair you're sitting on. And then there's someone so unpretentious, young, smart, almost like a muse, a fountain of vitality. That's something that draws you in. And it also says something about him, that he was looking for that. So I don't want to completely idealize him, but he was someone who enjoyed thinking and was capable of it.
Spaß am Denken hatte und denken konnte. Und
ausgerechnet diese Person wird dann
And of all people, this person is then murdered in 1989. Where do your investigative inquiries currently stand, including the conversations you've had? You've already said you have no evidence of a political assassination. But where does your research stand at the moment?
Wo ist Ihre Recherche im Moment?
My
research was aimed at finding out what was Herrhausen doing then. In other words, my initial working hypothesis was, why was the RAF interested in assassinating him? I've explained that to you. It's quite easy to explain. And then, what was Herrhausen working on? That's when I discovered that in Germany, it wasn't reported that he was involved with Russia, that peace with Russia was a major issue for him. I found that in Anglo-Saxon literature. When I then looked at what happened, I wrote to Gorbachev, while he was still alive, and asked, what was the situation with Herrhausen? Because that person was important to him, and I even got a reply. And Gorbachev wrote that Herrhausen was one of the few people who understood what he wanted. So, those are just 2 sentences referring to that. It's a long speech, and it was actually shortly before his death. But it was clear from that, and he said, if you want to know what my ideas were, read the following books I wrote. I wrote it all down. And then I spoke with Chelchik, who described to me that at that time in Russia, people knew what they didn't want anymore, but they didn't know what they wanted afterwards. He described how people were walking around with Ludwig Erhard's book, Prosperity for All, under their arms, and that it was a completely unregulated situation. So it was pure chaos. Glasnost worked, but perestroika was the transformation into chaos. So something was missing. And then I've done a lot of interviews, as I always do, including with someone who was involved with Solidarity, with Tusk, by the way. And he said it was exactly the same for us. That's where I got this quote. He said, "We knew exactly what we didn't want anymore, but we had no idea what we wanted." And then Tusk came with a bunch of people from the US, and within weeks, everything had been transformed. And we were just standing there. What's going on here? Yes, so to speak. The structure was imposed from the outside, and there were, similar to Germany between the GDR and the FRG, so the people who had brought about the upheaval in the GDR never actually got a say in joint discussions about what the new state should look like. Instead, it was regulated from the outside, so to speak. And it was the same with the negotiations with Gorbachev. I read through those negotiations with Gorbachev very carefully, and Gorbachev was of the opinion that Germany should become neutral. That was his demand, which I also find very understandable. I would have even welcomed it. So that would have been, it's obvious, it's probably immediately clear to him why. So he wants a buffer. He wants to have a buffer state. And if he now allows Germany to be unified, which he has viewed positively from the beginning, then there should be no possible threat. NATO should not move eastward. And the Americans get him to agree that Germany remains in NATO by saying, very briefly, you can read about this in Mark Trachtenberg's work. If you're not familiar with it, it's definitely something I highly recommend to you. Then the Americans say, just take a look at how it was. Germany after World War I, they weren't in any bloc anymore. They were basically neutral. They were non-aligned. And what happens? They immediately build up a huge military force, and then the next World War II comes right away. And if they can act independently again, they might get the idea to want nuclear weapons and become a military power. And then you've got them by the throat again. It's better if we, the Americans, their good friends, keep an eye on the Germans in NATO, because they're like that. If you water them too much, little swastikas always start popping up. So, if we keep an eye on them. This is for me now, he didn't say that, okay? So, if you want to keep Germany in check, it's good if it stays in NATO. Think about whether it's really in your interest if Germany becomes neutral. And unfortunately, Gorbachev swallowed that bait, hook, line, and sinker. That's the reason, and that's what Herrhausen is referring to when he mentions Bismarck. If you know the history of Bismarck as an envoy, he said, if Germany and Russia understand each other, there will be peace in Europe. So what he's referring to is the possibility of making Europe a center of power again, but in a way that is actually good for the Americans. As a Popper supporter, that is. We are all part of a Western mindset. I am the overachiever when it comes to norms, Western norms, so you should see me as a dear friend. He didn't realize, and I think nobody in Germany understood this, that geopolitics is more important than these Sunday speeches and philosophical things that you sprinkle like gold dust on your system to make it smell and look better. There are other interests behind it. And he was someone who took this very seriously as an opportunity and failed because of it. That would be my analysis.
Yes, I think that's a very, very intelligent summary you're giving here, even though we don't know exactly who ordered what, when and where. It's also possible that the RAF simply... So in fact, it was the RAF that did this, and no one else was behind it. But the point is that this eliminated one of the people in Germany who had a different vision for the future, which also explains why we are where we are today.
There's a bit more to it than that. I didn't just come up with the idea, so to speak, by intensely sucking on my own fingers. I talked to people from that time. Not Telchik, that's not who I'm talking about. I need to check if I'm allowed to say who. Someone from Helmut Kohl's circle, who told me that the murder of Herrhausen was indeed understood as a warning. That one shouldn't push further in that direction, similar to what Olof Palme did, where there were also such statements. When Palme was murdered, it was said, I think it was Schlesinger, maybe even the CIA chief, who said, I'm not sure, you'll have to look it up, but the statement was that after Palme's murder, Sweden went back to conducting foreign policy as was appropriate for the country and stopped interfering in major geopolitical issues.
Sich nicht einmischt in die großen geopolitischen Fragen. Es gibt noch weitere Indizien. Ich kann zwei, die ich vielleicht.
There are further indications. I can name two, perhaps. There was a conversation in the summer of '89, a heated debate between Kissinger and Herrhausen in New York. By the way, George Soros was also present, as was the entire elite of German industry and part of the American elite. Incidentally, I thought Soros asked the smartest questions. So, the discussion was about Kissinger warning against getting involved with the Soviet Union. The example was China. It was right after Tiananmen, which we now know wasn't as it was portrayed at the time. But back then, the message was, see, that's what happens. Kissinger's warning was that this is a system. Actually, he was arguing from a Marxist perspective.
Also eigentlich marxistisch argumentiert. Da können einzelne Personen nichts dran ändern.
Individual people can't change anything about that, and they just get pushed aside. The old apparatchiks, the hardliners, come out and are removed. And Gorbachev is not able to change the Soviet system. But Herrhausen argues against that and says that from his own experience, he can say, Gorbachev is trying to change things everywhere he can. He tells people, you have to decide for yourselves. Moscow will no longer decide. He is fighting with tremendous energy against a giant monster, and we have to help him. It is in our own interest to help him. And if we really believe that our system is superior, why are we afraid to help him?
Warum haben wir Angst, ihm zu helfen? Sollte Angst vor einer Öffnung haben, nicht wir.
He should be the one afraid of an opening, not us. And then he says, and of course, now there is this close relationship between Kohl and Gorbachev. And one could also have a conversation, Kohl, Gorbachev, Bush. And then Kissinger, in a very condescending way, says, you can already see that you haven't understood this. This is about nuclear strategies. Then there's a conversation between Gorbachev and Bush, and perhaps Mr. Kohl may be present, but nothing more. And from that you can see. So what Herrhausen is doing there is, he is forging ahead. He can do it, he has the means, but he is operating in an area where the issues are completely different from what was being publicly discussed in the media at the time.
Medial, öffentlich diskutiert hat. Und dann kommt eben diese Aussage von dem Mann aus der.
And then there's this statement from the man in Kohl's circle, who says, and we understood that as a warning not to go too far. So that means things like this are never discussed publicly here. And up until that point, you could say that discussing geopolitics was considered a kind of conspiracy theory in Germany. It wasn't common in the media either. So there was this lack of real reasons to understand it. A good example is, now the Soviet Union no longer exists. I was a volunteer in the German armed forces. We were told, totalitarian ideology, we have to be able to defend ourselves against it.
Wir müssen uns dagegen verteidigen können. Das ist, Kommunismus hat 5 Zacken der Stahl.
That's communism. 5-pointed star. Conquering the whole world. Abolition of freedom of speech. Rhubarb. The whole package. And now you see, now in Russia we have a program, a conservative, very Christian-oriented state. 80% of Russians identify as Christians. A completely different structure. And yet the same conflict structures as with the Soviet Union are still active. That means that wasn't it at all. That wasn't it at all. The real factor is something entirely different. And these factors are being discussed by you, by some others. We need to talk about them in order to understand what's going on. And Herrhausen walked right into this big bear trap.
Ja, und wir müssen uns mit diesen Fällen auseinandersetzen. Ich hatte auch eine.
We need to address these cases. I also had a discussion with Evarist Bartolo about Enrico Mattei, who was also a humanist economist, but an Italian.
Das ist für mich der ähnlichste Fall in der Struktur. Jemand, der
a brilliant manager who turns everything around, but who also always thinks in the interest of everyone. He basically built his own economic system in Italy. And he was taken down because at the same time, with Algeria, he had a good relationship with Kennedy. So those are the structures, exactly.
Das sind die Strukturen, genau.
Und dann haben wir diese Todesfälle dieser Leute.
And then we have these deaths of these people, including Olof Palme, including Dag Hammarskjöld, which all seem to point in a certain direction. And as you said well before the meeting, before our recording here, if coincidences don't scatter, but all go in one direction, then you should look for the cause. Well, we definitely need to continue this conversation next time. Unfortunately, I have to go now, but could you briefly tell us before we finish what you recommend as the best reading on these cases at the moment, and when your book will be published?
So I'm currently working on writing. I'm way too late with the book. My publisher probably wants to publicly flog me. That's all true. But what I recommend, what really helped me understand what's going on there, is if you read the book by James W. Douglas about the John F. Kennedy murder case, which I'm also working on, JFK and the Unspeakable. Unfortunately, it's not available in German. Kennedy und das Unsagbare. It is by far the best book on the Kennedy case, where you see Kennedy, this was a coup d'etat, because he and Khrushchev started talking and basically began to end the Cold War, in the face of an almost war situation in Cuba. Both stare into the abyss of nuclear war, step back, and begin to work together with increasing trust. And when you know that Khrushchev fell to his knees and wept when he learned that Kennedy had been shot, that he asked Castro to negotiate with Kennedy, Khrushchev said, "You can negotiate with this man. I trust him." If you see that at the moment, when it all starts, that's something I'm still working on in the book, by the way. There was a 1961 Hammarskjöld Commission, the Americans, Kennedy and Khrushchev. SOIN is what it's called, SOIN Papers in the US. And that's actually where the idea that's in the UN Charter, which comes from Immanuel Kant, for perpetual peace, originated. They talk about the need to abolish nuclear weapons. The first step that was taken, the abolition of atmospheric tests. Kennedy proposes a joint moon landing. There you can see, so to speak, that we are entering a competition between systems. We want to show who does more for the people. And that's exactly what this meeting is about, where they then say, abolish nuclear weapons, reduce arms to a level needed only to defend the country, place the weapons under the supreme authority of the UN. That's Immanuel Kant. I thought this wasn't being addressed in the academic world. And then you see, this man dies in a coup because he is actively working for peace. And then, in the last flyer published in Dallas on the day he was shot, it says that he wants to hand over sovereignty to the UN with the enemies, that he is soft on communism, and that he is working with our opponents in Rhodesia. That's the Hammarskjöld case. Why Hammarskjöld? Because you see, there really is a connection, a link, and it's this. If you cross that line, well, you can argue in the direction of war like MERS, and that won't be fatal. But if you move toward abolishing this structure, in other words, if you do what we wish politicians would do, namely, be able to create a peaceful new world order, and there are people who have the capacity to do that, then it becomes life-threatening.
Then you die. Yes. So it's highly interesting. We will continue to discuss this, maybe even in a panel with some colleagues. Mr. Pohlmann, thank you very much for your time today.
Yes, and thank you very much for the work you do. I find it incredible. I also can't believe that it's possible, that you have the opportunity. Wonderful.
I'd also like to briefly say here, I would never kill myself. And if anything ever happens, then it was the CIA. Then it was the CIA. Best regards, Mr. Pohlmann. Thank you. Goodbye.